Is that on? No. Okay. Yep. All right. Good. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name's Rich. I'm a bookseller here. As many of you know, we're back to in-person events at the store now, as well as having virtual events, partnered and supported events, trips and classes. For a full list of everything, please check our website, politics-prose.com. We have monthly handouts at the front of the store, as well as a calendar each month, so you can check that out. Before we get started today, I just want to ask you to silence your cell phones or turn them off, just so as not to disrupt the event. When we get time to opening the floor for questions, we've got a standing microphone just in front of this pillar here. So we'll ask you if you can line up to the right of the pillar and just be sure to speak into the microphone, as we are recording live streaming today's event, and it'll be on YouTube for you all to watch later, or any of your friends and family if you want to let them know, on the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. So following the Q&A, we'll have a sign up here at this table. So if you've not purchased the book, you can do so behind the register. And then again, we'll have the signing line to the right of this pillar here, and we'll come by and ask your names for personalizations and things like that. So please have the books ready for us. And once the event is complete, we'll ask you just to fold up the chairs and prop them up against something sturdy just to help us out a bit. Okay, so without further ado, today we're very excited to be welcoming John Feinstein. He's the author of a whopping 45 books, including two New York Times #1 bestsellers, A Season on the Brink and A Good Walk Spoiled. He is a member of 6 Hall of Fames and is contributing columnist for the Washington Post. He has spent 4 decades finding intriguing sports characters and narratives and turning them into classic books, and his latest chronicles the life and career of David Feherty. The two have known each other for years, beginning with Feinstein's work on A Good Walk Spoiled. Researched and written at a time when Feherty won 5 times in Europe and was on the 91 Ryder Cup team, but also a functioning alcoholic. His work finds balance between hilarious tales at the height of Feherty's fame and the darker moments in the golfer's life. So please join me in welcoming John Feinstein.
Thank you, Rich, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming out on a Sunday afternoon, even those of you who went to Syracuse. That's for a friend of mine. But it's good to be back at Politics and Prose. My first book signing in 1986, when I was 9 years old, was at Politics and Prose across the street. I don't know how many of you remember that location, but so it's I've been here many times. I worked with both Brad Graham and Lissa Muscatine at the Washington Post, and I'm so glad that they've done such a wonderful job with the store since they took over. I'm grateful to them, not only as an author, but as a reader, for doing that work. And I would say quickly about the 6 Halls of Fame. That's just proof that getting into Halls of Fame isn't that hard. Although I do know exactly where to start. David Feherty is a remarkable man. I have known him, as Rich said, for about 30 years. The first time I saw him up close, he was stretched across 3 chairs in the back of a room during orientation for the PGA Tour. He had played very successfully in Europe for a number of years, had won 5 times on the European Tour, played in the famous War by the Shore Ryder Cup in 1991, beat Payne Stewart in the singles when Payne was the U.S. Open champion. That's how good a player he was. He had come home from a tournament in Germany in 1993 and found a note from his wife saying, "Move to Dallas." That was it. Moved, past tense. She was gone, and so were their 2 young boys. And so David moved to Dallas to be with his sons and had to go back to square one, on the PGA Tour. because his status in Europe meant nothing here. So he played 3 stages of PGA Tour qualifying school, made it through easily because, as I said, at that point, he was a very good player. But he had to go to this orientation, even though he was 35 years old and he'd been a pro for 18 years. He turned pro at 17 because that's what the tour said. And so David went out, as Rich mentioned. David's been a functioning alcoholic since he was in his teenage years. He still fights it every day. He's been on and off the wagon many times. He was drinking at that point, and he'd been out the night before. And so when this woman was telling people how to deal with the media, David was asleep across the 3 chairs that I mentioned. And what was interesting is, how many of you have seen Bull Durham? Just about all of you. So you remember the famous Crash Davis speech about how to deal with the media. Always say you give 110%, you just want to step up, you thank God for the chance, you love your teammates. Well, that's what this woman was basically telling them all that to do when they dealt with the media. And David did finally wake up, and he listened for a minute or two, and he put his hand up, and she said yes, and he said, "What's wrong with just telling the truth?" And instantly liked him at that moment. I said, this is a guy I think I can become friends with. And I did become friends with him eventually. But to begin at the beginning, as people say, I was once at a Hall of Fame induction, and a guy who was being inducted 20 minutes into his speech said, "So to begin this story at the beginning," and I went, 20 minutes in, so at least I'm only 6 minutes in. But when the day David was born, his father, who was an alcoholic, had been drinking, and he was supposed to name his son William David Feherty, but he was drunk. So when he filled out the birth certificate, he became David William Feherty. And so that's why he's David Feherty. And that was sort of symbolic in a way of David's life. David's life has been all over the place, for good and for bad. That's why the subtitle of the book is about the humor and about the tragedy. The tragedy is very real. Tragedy may be the most overused word in sports, other than very unique, because there's no such thing as very unique. You can't be very one of a kind. But, you know, somebody hits the ball in the water, misses a short putt, oh, tragic. I used to argue with Brandel Chambly, who's a friend, when we worked together at Golf Channel, because Brandel would say, well, he had a tragedy on the 17th hole. And I said, no, he didn't. He made a bogey. Nobody died. But David has dealt with genuine tragedy in his life, most notably the death of his firstborn son, Shay, 5.5 years ago to a drug overdose, which David, not surprisingly, still blames himself for, because that's what a parent's going to do in that situation. I actually got to interview Bill Clinton for this book, because he's one of 3.3 presidents who appeared on David's television show, Feherty. And it was Bill Clinton appeared, Barack Obama appeared, George Bush II appeared, and Donald Trump appeared. I got that out. That's pretty good for me. But when I talked to Bill Clinton, he was one of the first people who called David after Shay died, and he said he spent an hour on the phone with David trying to convince him it wasn't his fault. And he said, but you know, in the end, you're a parent, something like that happens, you're going to think it's your fault. And David's, I mean, I still love spending time with David. He's still the funniest guy I know, but he's not been the same. How can you be the same after a loss like that since then? And I don't think he's as funny on television. He and I discussed that during my research, as he once was. He's just not as comfortable with himself as much as anything. He doesn't blame anybody he's worked for, whether it was NBC, who he was working for at the time, or now LIV Golf, and I'll get into that more before I'm done. But David grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And he said it wasn't until he left Northern Ireland to travel as a professional golfer that he realized his childhood wasn't normal, because all he knew was a world in which you heard bombs going off every day, people died every day, there were ID checks and stops all the time, whether you were on the way to school or work or whatever. And to him, that was what life was, because it was the only life he'd known. Then he traveled, went other places, and realized that that wasn't normal, and realized as he got older how much that way of growing up had affected him, which is, again, understandable. I think that when some of our children grow up, they will remember COVID and how different it was, and going to school at home and not seeing your friends and things like that. So, but David was undiagnosed ADD, as many kids were in those days. He was born in 1958. And he said that a lot of his teachers made him feel stupid because of his ADD, because he couldn't concentrate on a lot of things. But he was a prodigy in one area, believe it or not, music. He was a very gifted piano player and a gifted singer. And his parents thought that would be his path out of Bangor, Northern Ireland, which is about 12 miles from Belfast. But he also played golf. His dad was a golfer. David used to caddy for his dad every weekend. He had a regular foursome, like so many people do. And he also says he believes he got his sense of humor from his parents, that being funny is almost a sixth sense if you're Irish. And he tells a story about his mom. Mom used to fix dinner every night on the table, 6 o'clock. And his dad wasn't always home at 6 o'clock. He often went to the pub after work. He worked on the docks in Belfast when David was young. And he said one night his dad came home, and he wasn't as late as usual. And he said, is my dinner still warm? And David's mother said, yeah, it absolutely is warm. It's in the dog's stomach. His dad, David tells a story about his dad, who was having trouble sleeping. And one of the guys in his foursome was a doctor. And he asked the doctor if he could prescribe a sleeping pill for him to help him sleep. And the doctor was a little reluctant to prescribe a sleeping pill. So he said, what have you done to try to sleep? And Billy Feherty told him all the various things he tried. And he said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Tonight, when you go to sleep, I want you to close your eyes and pretend you're on the first tee, right here at the golf club. Smell the grass, feel the breeze, look at the trees in your mind's eye, and then start to play. Just play the first hole, keep going. He said, you're going to be asleep by the turn, because this works. So he says, okay, I'll try it. So the next morning, they get to the first tee, and the doctor says, how'd you sleep last night, Billy? He said, I didn't sleep at all. Did you try my method? Yeah, I did. Well, what happened? He said, first hole, hit it right down the middle. Knocked it on the green, made the birdie putt. Second hole, I hit it in a divot, but I hit a good shot out and then made a 50-footer for birdie. I'm 2 under par. Never 2 under par. Third hole, I pushed the drive way right, and I go looking for my ball. And he said, well, what happened? He said, I'm still looking for that damn ball. Didn't sleep a wink. So David's sense of humor, he came by honestly, so to speak. And as I mentioned, he dropped out of high school as a junior because he didn't like his teachers, and he thought it was a waste of time. And he had a choice at that point. Did he pursue his musical career, or did he pursue his golf career? Well, he's better at music, to be honest. He was a 5 handicap at that time. Now, for any of us in this room, with maybe an exception or two somewhere, 5 handicap is pretty good. But if you want to be a professional golfer and make a living, 5 handicap's not pretty good. But he decided he wanted to try it, much to the chagrin of his parents, who thought that was a terrible idea. Well, he became a club pro, because he wasn't good enough to make the tour in Europe at that point, and worked at several different clubs around the United Kingdom. He worked at one club near Belfast, where twice while he was working there, the clubhouse was blown up. Again, different life in Northern Ireland. But he kept working in his game, kept grinding, trying to get better. And finally, in his third try at qualifying school over there, he made it through, made it to the tour. First 2 years on tour, made almost nothing. Kept working, got better. And his first win on the European Tour, interestingly, was in Venice. And as you all know, you can't drive a car in Venice. And there are a number of islands that make up Venice. And they were playing on an island, no cars, and the people running the tournament gave all the players tricycles to get from the hotel each morning to the golf course. And David said they looked like a bunch of, they looked like a circus riding their tricycles from the hotel to the golf course every morning. Well, David wins the tournament. He actually beat Seve Ballesteros, who was his hero, down the stretch. And two things happened that, after he won. The first thing was, on BBC Radio, the interviewer had heard that David was a talented singer. So he asked David if he could sing something. And David, in his best operatic voice, sang something from a commercial called One Cornetto, which I guess was an ice cream cone. And it was so good, people were convinced that he was a professional singer. I mean, he was good. The second thing that happened was when they gave him the trophy, he got on his tricycle to ride back to the hotel. And the sight of him in the tricycle trying to balance the trophy was one that anybody who saw it thought was pretty darn funny. But he went on, kept playing, got better, got married. He spent a fair amount of time playing in South Africa during the winter because he had family there. And he met a woman who was a South African beauty queen, Caroline, and they got married. And David said that the marriage was a disaster from the beginning. Partly his fault, partly her fault. But it just didn't work. He called it a 9-year nightmare. But they did have 2 sons. And then Caroline left for Dallas with the 3-word note left behind. And that was when David came to the United States, played on the PGA Tour over here. I skipped over the Ryder Cup, which isn't something you should skip over in golf. As I said, he made the team in '91. He was 8th on the money list in Europe. And that was the year of the famous War by the Shore at Kiowa Island. And David played Payne Stewart in the singles on Sunday. And by the back 9, it was so close and so tense, the marshals and security basically lost control of the crowd. They were all inside the ropes, you know. And, of course, the marshals made sure the American players got from each green to each tee, surrounded so they could get there. Not so much for the Europeans. So David was 2 up after 16 holes. But he was uptight because Payne had won the last 2 holes. David was playing out of his mind. And he's walking 16 green to 17 tee. There are people swarming all over. He finally gets to the tee, and a marshal pushes him back and says, "Hey, buddy, you can't come up here." And fortunately, Payne intervened. Payne had this great sort of off-the-wall sense of humor. And he said to the marshal, he said, "You know, I can completely understand why you don't want this blank up on the tee. But unfortunately, I need him up here with me. So please let him go by." Payne later regretted that because David proceeded to hit the shot of his life. 243-yard par 3, swirling winds, water on the right. David hit a 1-iron, which nobody hits 1-irons anymore. They all play the hybrids. He hit a 1-iron to about 10 feet, 2-putted for par, and won the match. And how many of you have heard Lee Trevino's great line on a 1-iron? 1, 2, 3. It's a great line. He said if he ever got caught in a lightning storm, he just raised a 1-iron over his head because even God can't hit a 1-iron. But so David won that match, and he said the highlight of the week for him was that Seve Ballesteros was the star of the European team at the time, and he every night would give everybody a pep talk. We're better than they are. We're going to win. I mean, they had won in '85. They'd won in '87. They had tied and retained the cup in '89, which is why the Americans called it the War by the Shore. A little over the top there for a golf match. But Seve kept saying, "We're going to win. We're better than they are." And he said that the night before the singles, he was giving David a massage on his back. "You're better than Payne Stewart. You're going to beat Payne Stewart. I just know it." And, of course, he did. And David said, "Wow, Seve and I are friends. This is so cool. I'm friends with Seve Ballesteros." And the next week, the European Tour was in Stuttgart. And David walked in the locker room. First person he saw was his new best friend, Seve. And he said, "Seve, how are you?" And Seve said, "Donald, how are you?" So maybe not best friends. But David moved to the United States, as I said, and his career kind of fell apart there. Not because he couldn't play well, but because he had various injuries, elbows, both his elbows, back problems. He was still drinking, and his marriage was in shambles. So in 1996, he was in the locker room during a rain delay at the old international tournament outside of Denver. The rain delays there were so prevalent that Jim Nance told me that in their pre-tournament production meetings, they would plan for the rain delays because thunderstorms would come in almost every afternoon. So they're in a rain delay on Thursday, and David's sitting in the locker room just telling people stories. And around the corner, Gary McCord is looking for ways to kill time on the air for USA Network. And he hears David telling these stories. And he thought, this guy's really funny. I don't even know him, but he's really funny. He walked up to David and introduced himself. They'd never met. And said, "Look, we're going to have a long day tomorrow because of this rain delay. Why don't you come and after you finish playing," because David was playing early the next day, and sit in the tower with me. And David was like, "Well, I don't know." I said, "Yeah, come and do it." So he did. And according to Gary, he said things that were smarter and funnier than anything anybody had ever heard on television. Even though Frank Jerkinian, who was the executive producer at the time, was furious at McCord for inviting David to come up to the tower because he thought David was crazy. And by the way, he was right, because David is crazy. But he was brilliant. And a year later, David was sitting in a bar in Akron at the old World Series of Golf. And he, as he said, I was still an athlete, so I was drinking Gatorade with my vodka. And two men came up and introduced themselves and said they were from CBS. One was Lance Barrow, who'd become the executive producer of CBS Golf, and the other was Rick Gentile, who was the executive producer of CBS Sports at the time. And they said, "Have you got a couple minutes to talk?" And David said the first thing he thought was, "Oh God, 60 Minutes is doing an expose on athletes who drink. That's why they want to talk to him." Well, no, they wanted to talk to him about possibly coming to work for them. And they gave him a 3-tournament tryout. And of course, he was great. And they knew he was great right away. And they got a little bit of luck. According to Lance Barrow, they got a little bit of luck. And the luck was that they had guys in all their towers. They had 4 basic towers in those days. It was Jim Nance and Ken Venturi on 18. It was McCord on 17. It was Vern Lundquist on 16 and Bobby Clempen on 15. And they would bring in extra guys for the Masters. But Lance Barrow decided that rather than have David share a tower with somebody, he'd have him walk with the last group. Guys walking with players was still fairly new at that point. Bob Rosberg had invented it for ABC, and then Judy Rankin joined Rosberg. They invented it, but it was still fairly new. And he said it was one of those deals, Lance said, it's one of those deals where you do something because it seems easier, and it turns out to be genius. And it was genius, because David, being down on the ground with the players, up close, talking to them, they respected him because they knew he'd been a very good player, and he was funny. And even Tiger Woods liked him. Tiger Woods doesn't like anybody. But he liked David, partly because David never asked anything of him. He just wanted to talk about how great a player Tiger was. David likes to say of the 50 best shots he's seen in his life, Tiger hit 49 of them. And he'd be in an impossible spot, and he would look at David and smile and say, "Watch this, Farty," because they called each other Farty because they like to have farting contests. But David, in his stand-up act, which if you've never seen it, I highly recommend it. Read the book first, but then go see the stand-up act. Talks about Tiger telling him dirty jokes during the round and pulling his cap down so nobody could read his lips. And one of Tiger's favorite jokes, according to David, was one where he'd say, "Hey, Farty, what do you call a black guy flying an airplane?" David would go, "I don't know." And he'd say, you call him a blanking pilot, you racist, which makes sense. But David became a star, as I think we all know, on CBS. And then Golf Channel came into the picture and asked him to do an interview show. Initially, they wanted him to do a situation comedy where he would play himself. And they actually filmed one segment, one show, and according to Tom Stathakis, who was running Golf Channel at the time, it was so bad they never aired it, which turned out to be a break, because then they came up with the idea for the interview show, and it was brilliant because David is so smart. What David does, and I can relate to this a little bit as someone who's interviewed a few people, is so many interviewers, especially on television, they've got a list of questions. And if somebody says, I cheated to win the U.S. Open, the next question will be, well, how's your putting? Because they don't know to follow up. David always followed up. He would listen. Listening is a very underrated skill in interviewing. And as I said, presidents wanted to come on the show, celebrities came on the show, golfers, athletes from other sports came on the show. John McEnroe came on the show and was great, by the way. And so the show became kind of a phenomenon in itself. And Dick Ebersol, who was running NBC at the time, wanted David Feherty full-time. He wanted him working for NBC. And so they basically went and said, what do we need to do to get you? And of course the money was a factor, but David had decided that he was old enough now that he didn't want to walk anymore, 18 holes, 2-3 days a week. And he asked them to put him in a tower. And they agreed. And the problem was David wasn't as good in the tower. He was better when he was down there with the players. When you work in a tower, you don't actually watch live golf. You just watch the monitor. Even when the players are right in front of you on that hole, you watch the monitor so you can see what the viewers are seeing. And David didn't enjoy it as much and didn't bring the same Feherty humor to it. He was still good. He just wasn't as good. And then Golf Channel had a complete disaster. They hired a guy named Mike McCarley to run the network, who was Dick Ebersol's PR guy. How a PR guy is qualified to run a network, I don't know. I wasn't consulted. But Mike basically, nice guy, ran Golf Channel into the ground. And they were losing so much money, they had to lay off like 200 people, and they canceled David's show. And that really hurt David, because he loved doing the show. He loved the people he worked with. He loved the challenge. And now he doesn't have a show, and he's working in a tower. And then Shay dies. And Shay died of an overdose in July of 2017, I'm sorry. It's been almost 6 years. And I mean, to say David was crushed is a vast understatement. I was very fortunate in terms of being able to write about that part of David's life, because David was willing to talk about it, but he didn't remember much. He was totally blanked out in the days after Shay's death. But David's wife, Anita, his current wife, Anita, they've been married 27 years now, and his son, Rory, not named after Rory McIlroy, but his son, Rory, and his daughter, Erin, remembered it all very well. And in fact, Rory was kind enough to send me a copy of the eulogy he wrote for his brother, which is heartbreaking to read. And it was a terrible time. And David has come out of it as best he can. He started drinking again. What a shock under those circumstances. He went to rehab at one point. He likes to tell people he flunked rehab. He left after 12 days. He said when they gave him what they called an adult coloring book to color in, he said, that was it. What am I doing here? And I speak as a mother, as the son of a mother who went to rehab and was helped greatly by it. So I'm not in a position to put rehab down, but it wasn't right for David. And he's been fighting, as he said, every day is a white knuckle ride to try to not drink. and he's come a long way. I mean, he did all sorts of drugs in the 90s. In fact, his first date with Anita, they were set up by mutual friends, and they went to a restaurant, and when they sat down, David took a straw, leaned across the table, and drained Anita's drink. He was drunk, at which point Anita said, you know what, I gotta go, and got up and left. And David was horrified by his behavior and asked their mutual friend if he would ask Anita to give him one more chance. And Anita did. They went to a baseball game together. He showed up sober, and long story short, fell in love. And I asked Anita, I said, after what happened on the first date, why in the world did you go out with him the second time? And she said, I've thought about that for 27 years, especially when things get tough. But she said, I sensed in him, even drunk, I sensed in him a kindness, and it's a generosity of spirit. And that is a key to understanding David Feherty. He has a remarkable generosity of spirit. He's an American citizen now. He has raised more than $30 million for a group that he started. He went on a Wounded Warriors trip to Iraq and came back and said, there are ways to do more for military guys, not just the ones who are physically wounded, but ones who are emotionally wounded. So he started Troops First, and as I said, they have events all year, and he's raised more. He and his partners have raised more than $30 million to help out these guys. I'm going to wrap up here in a minute so we can get to questions. I have to talk about LIV. In March of 2022, as I mentioned, these things had been happening with NBC and the Golf Channel, and David had one more year left on his contract. And he got a call from Greg Norman, who he always got along with. Not that many people get along with Greg Norman, but I did, by the way. But David did. And Greg Norman said to him, I'm running LIV, which of course David knew, and I want you to be our John Madden. And David lived in the U.S. long enough to know what that means. And he was flattered, and he said, let me think about it. And he consulted, of course, with his family. He consulted with his agent, several very close friends, not me. But then Greg came back with a money offer. And when I heard that he was going to make the move, I sent him a text, and I said, you mean to tell me, because I was right near the end of the book. I said, you mean to tell me I have to rewrite the last 2 chapters of this book so you can make a couple million measly extra dollars? And he wrote me back, he says, it's not a couple million measly extra dollars. It's a lot more than that. And unlike many of the guys who've gone to LIV, who said, oh, I just want to grow the game, I want to, take it more worldwide, this is such a new idea, it's all great. David said, I went because of the blank in money. It was all about the money. Now, Harold Varner III has said that it's generational money, and it is, by the way. I'd like to stand up here and say, no matter what, I wouldn't take any money from LIV, it's sports washing. But if I was offered that kind of money, I have to at least think about it. I hope I'd say no, but I can't stand here and swear to you that I'd say no. So he took the money, and it's worth noting that with 1 year left on his contract, NBC was retiring both Roger Maltby and Gary Koch, who are in the same age group as he is. He lost his Golf Channel show, and so this was 5 years of guaranteed money and guaranteed work. And I know nobody's watching LIV right now. I am because of David, but I'm an exception to the rule at the moment. But who knows what will happen? People ask me all the time, what's going to happen with LIV in the PGA Tour? And my sage answer is, I have no idea. I do think that at some point they're going to have to sit down like the AFL and NFL did, like the ABA and NBA did, like the NHL and WHA did, and they're going to have to figure out a way to work together. Because you got to have the best players in the world playing against each other, regardless of the sport. One of the things that's hurt tennis so much is that the best players almost never play against each other, except in the Grand Slams. And eventually, if things were to stay the way they are, other than the guys who've won major championships. None of the LIV guys would be high enough in the world golf rankings to make it into the majors. That's not a good thing. So we'll see what happens. I honestly can't predict what'll happen. I want to just finish quickly here, excuse me, with a story that is at the end of the book and I think defines David very well. I was having dinner in Philadelphia before the 2018 Ryder Cup with David and Rory McIlroy. David and Rory are very close. David has been a mentor to Rory. He actually knew Rory's parents when he worked at Hollywood Golf Club in Northern Ireland. David and Rory grew up 5 miles apart, but David was born in 1958, Rory was born in 1989. But we're having dinner, and I looked at David, and as I said, he's very proud of being an American citizen. And I said, okay, when the Ryder Cup comes up here in a couple weeks, you played for Europe, you're an American citizen. Who do you root for? Who do you really root for? It's just the three of us in this room. And he said, it's easy. I'm an American. I root for the U.S. And I said, really? He said, absolutely, 100%. And Rory looked at him and said, will you at least root for me in my matches? And David said, only if they don't decide the outcome. And I said to Rory, I said, how do you feel about that? And he said, it's David. This is who he is. I love him for being him. And I feel that way about him. And people have asked me, was it hard to write a book about a friend, especially a friend who's had real tragedy and real issues in his life and has made all sorts of mistakes in his life? And I said no, because David made it easy, because he was so honest about, he never once said, I don't want to talk about that. He never once pulled a punch. And for that, I'm very grateful, and that's why I think it's a good book. Not because I did anything special, but because David's so special. So, thank you all very much. Thank you. Just to repeat what Tim said, if you have a question, come on up to the mic and ask away. Or come down to the mic if you're in the front.
Yeah. Well, it isn't far for me, so
No.
That's not really much of a problem. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. He's a fascinating character. I've followed his career really from the very early days of him as a European golfer. Mm-hmm. I have a couple of questions, and I'll just do one and then see if anyone else wants to jump in. So my first question is, to what extent do you think David's problem with alcohol actually impacted his career, his performances on screen, and the opportunities that were presented to him in the media?
Well, I think they did affect his playing career because between the alcohol and the injuries and his marriage, it all added up eventually. But he told me he never had a drink before he was on air. Either at CBS or at NBC, or certainly doing the Golf Channel show. Now, the one time he did get in trouble was he had finished, he was never comfortable at the Masters, partly because they made him work out of a tower. No one's allowed to walk at the Masters. But partly because he's a blue-collar kid from Bangor, Northern Ireland. And now, he's at a place where every member is a multi-millionaire. And even though he said they were always nice to him, he never felt comfortable. But he always did the Thursday, Friday late-night highlight show with Jim Nantz. So there was about a 4-hour break between going off the air on Thursday, Friday, and the show itself. And he said one night, he was bored, and before he drove his cart into Butler Cabin, he had a few drinks. And a few drinks with an alcoholic is more than a few drinks. And he drove his cart, into Butler Cabin. And he said, you know what? My car is out in the CBS lot. Why don't I bring it in here and park it right outside? Excuse me, it must be the water. Park it right outside the entrance so I can make a quick escape at midnight when we're off the air. Good idea. Poor execution. He missed Butler Cabin and drove onto the par 3 golf course. Cars don't belong on the par 3 golf course or anywhere else on the grounds at Augusta other than the parking lots. And he realized what he'd done and turned around, drove back around, and as he pulled into the actual lot in front of Butler Cabin, he saw 2 police cars with their lights flashing. And sure enough, policeman comes up to him, and he noticed when he rolled down his window, the name tag said, I always forget, it was an Irish name, Callahan, O'Reilly, something like that. And he said, maybe I can get out of this because we can talk Irish to each other. So when he rolled down the window, the cop said, "Sir, have you been drinking tonight?" And David, being David, looked at him and said, "Well, with that kind of a first question, I can see why you never passed the test for detective." A minute later, he was in zip handcuffs, and they were calling Jack Stevens, who was chairman of the club at the time, and saying, "What do you want us to do with this guy?" And Jack Stevens said, "Just let him go." And that gets back to what Anita said about David getting mulligans in life, because people like him. Jack Stevens, even the chairman of Augusta National, liked David Feherty. And they let him go. He did the show, and he was fine because it was 3 hours later. And the other interesting point about that is when David told me that story, again, I'm his friend, I said to him, "You really want that story in the book? You know, we don't have to put that story in the book." And he said, "John, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this right. And that story is a part of my life. So you go ahead and tell it." Anybody else, or do you have a second one? Here comes someone else.
Yeah, let's go to someone else. Come back.
For me, one of the windows that looks into Feherty's soul on his show was the one he did with Tom Watson.
Yeah, they're very close, as you know. I should have mentioned
Well,
that.
and also it was, I did not know that Tom Watson had a drinking problem,
Right.
but he revealed that
Right.
in his interview, that Feherty's empathy and skill set kind of out of his bones to do those kinds of interviews obviously told us a lot about Tom Watson, but it told us an awful lot about David Feherty
Yes, it did.
as well.
Yeah, and is there a question behind that before I
No,
go?
I just
okay.
but just
Well,
what
Tom and
you're-
David are very close, and Tom was the one who convinced David to go. He found him an AA group in Dallas that he felt comfortable with, and that helped David a lot. And the story, again, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but David was doing an exhibition match in Prince Edward Island, Canada, with Tom and Jack Nicklaus, and they were pre-taping interviews to cut in during the match itself the day before. And Tom looked at David and said, because Tom said later to me, he said, "When I looked at David, I saw myself a few years earlier." And Tom looked at David and said, "You're not well. You need help. Come back with me to Kansas City when this is over, and I'm going to find people to help you." And David, "Well, it's really hard to get to Kansas City from Prince Edward Island. Maybe I'll get in touch with you." And Nicholas jumped in and said, "I got a plane. I'll fly you both to Kansas City." And David said, that was pre-planned. And David said I was being bullied by Tom Watson and kidnapped by Jack Nicklaus. I had no chance. And of course, it turned out to be a very good thing for David.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hey, John, Bob Beeson, big fan, love your writing.
Thank you, Bob.
I'm looking forward to reading the book on the LIV issue, and you said it, nobody's watching. Feherty, on the air, in his interviews, he plays to an audience. Have you talked to him about what it's like playing to an empty room, so to speak?
Yes, I have. And by the way, LIV is here next week. I'm not trying to sell tickets, believe me. It's at a Trump golf course. But he's aware of it. And what he says is, look, I knew what was going to happen when I made this decision. I'm going from doing the U.S. Open to doing LIV Tulsa. I mean, there's no comparison, obviously. And he said, but he hopes as time goes by that the audience will build, and I think deep down he hopes that there's some kind of merger so that he'll be back on a network. I think I can honestly say I've never watched the CW until LIV. And I'm probably not alone in this room. But he's aware of it, put it that way.
Got it, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Please. It's you or I just talked to myself.
Well, it's a tough choice here, you know. One of the other things that I'm very curious about, David, is the passion of his Americanism.
Yes.
You know, I too am now a dual citizen of the UK and America.
We're in the UK.
And I know many, from the West Midlands, Wolverhampton. Okay. Not exactly the golfing capital of England, but there we are. And, you know, I know a lot of fellow semi-converts like me, but David's passion for the US is I think, right at the top end of the spectrum. And I wonder if you have any ideas about what it is about his life in America or about the characteristics of the United States that have made him so passionate an American.
Yeah, it's people like me. No, there's actually a specific answer to that question. As I mentioned, David went over to Iraq with Wounded Warriors a couple times and saw what it was like for the soldiers, saw met the soldiers. But he said they were flying back to Baghdad to fly actually to Germany first, but in midair, they were on a C-310, and in midair, they made a U-turn, which when you're in a war zone is pretty scary. And it was a bunch of golfers and a bunch of basketball coaches. And they make this U-turn, and they said to one of the pilots, well, what are we doing? What's going on here? And the pilot said, we're going to make an HR stop. And David said his first thought was, what in the world does human resources have to do with being in Iraq? It was human remains. And they stopped and picked up the body of an Army Ranger who had been killed to fly it back to Germany and then the United States. And David said that was so chilling a moment and made him realize so much the sacrifices that these soldiers were making, that it changed him from being someone who wanted to be an American to someone who was extremely proud to be an American. And so I think that's it. And the other thing is, he's been embraced here by people. I mean, I've been out with him a lot. The interesting thing is David is an introvert at heart. I mean, he's very happy just being with his family, being alone, whatever. But if he walked in here right now and you all wanted to talk to him, wanted an autograph, a selfie, whatever it was, you would think he was your best friend. He's great with that. In fact, his children, Rory and Aaron, both told me that of all the things about their father that they're proud of, it's the way he handles people, the way he treats people, that generosity of spirit that I mentioned. Because to them, you know, their father's a celebrity. Okay, fine, good for him. But what they really love is the way he handles people. And I think he's felt embraced by this country. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you for A Good Walk Spoiled.
Thank you.
Why I'm dressed as I am right now. So I have two questions. The first one, they're not very related, but the first one's actually about your creative process. So, like, your career is, I mean, it's just incredible. And so I'm just curious, how do you decide the topics for your books? Just, and it doesn't have to be specific, but just generally, you could write about a million different things.
Right.
So.
Well, it's not scientific, I can tell you that much. I've thought about books I've wanted to do in the car, in the shower, at dinner with somebody, listening to something on the radio. But I've been extraordinarily lucky because my first book, Season on the Brink, was the success that it was. And whatever else you want to say about Bob Knight, and there's plenty to say, I will always be grateful to him for that. And what that did was it allowed me to choose my topics going forward. What do you want to write about next, John? Now, my editors haven't always agreed with my idea. And when I wanted to do a Civil War, my Army-Navy book, my editors were like, none of them are going to play in the NFL. And that doesn't matter. You don't have to be rich and famous to have a great story to tell. That's something I learned from Bob Woodward when I was a police reporter at the Post, and I've always believed that. That's why my next book's going to be on Ivy League football, because I know the kids will be fascinating. I've already interviewed 42 of them. They are fascinating. And by the way, Somebody take a guess at how many Ivy League players are in the NFL right now. Just take a guess. 1, 2. How about 22? 22. They play much better football than people know because the silly presidents won't let them play in the postseason tournament. So people don't just get to see how good they are when they're playing against outsiders. Different story. I'll talk about that when I'm here next year. I hope. So I've always had that sort of independence to pick and choose my subjects. And, you know, I knew David had a great story to tell. There was no doubt in my mind about it. The question was getting him to feel comfortable doing it. And I was very flattered when I asked him about doing it. He said, "You're the only one I trust to do it." And that meant and means a lot to me.
And then this is also not directly related to the book, but I feel very excited to read the book, so I don't know that I need a ton more on the topic. But you've been around people that are so just, you know, Coach K, right? Just reached the pinnacle of excellence. Like, I'm relatively young in my career, and I'm just trying to think about someone like yourself. Like, are there common themes amongst those individuals that have achieved excellence that transcend just whatever they're doing?
If you're talking coaching, the common theme to me, first of all, being very smart. I mean, that's very underrated in coaches. I mean, every great coach I've known, Dean Smith, Bob Knight, Mike Krzyzewski, Jim Valvano, take your pick, were really smart and would have been good at anything they did. But the second thing is the ability to communicate. Anybody can. I could draw up X's and O's if I had Mike Krzyzewski's players, or Dean Smith's, or Bob Knight's, but I couldn't communicate with them. I couldn't get them to buy in. I couldn't get them to understand why I was saying and doing the things I was doing the way they could. People, one question I get asked all the time is, would Bob Knight be able to coach in today's world? Well, the Bob Knight of the 1980s, when I did the book, certainly could not, because so much has changed, and kids have changed, and one and done, and NILs and transfer. But great coaches adapt. Mike Krzyzewski's first Final Four was 1986. His last one was 2022. The entire basketball world changed in those 36 years, but he adapted with them, because that's what great coaches do. As far as great athletes are concerned, again, the obvious answer is ability, but there's a mental toughness. And one of the most underrated things about Tiger Woods is his mental toughness. He's obviously had great talent, but he was as mentally tough as any player I've ever seen. Jack Nicklaus right there, too.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We got time for one or two more, or is everybody done? Okay. Thank you all for coming out, and I'll be right here.
Thank you for coming.